more, that's absolutely fine. You just have to click opt out when you get there. So we have got a series of fantastic online talks coming up. Our next one is on March the 10th at 7 o'clock, which is our research project launch. So we're undertaking a new research project to research all the 30,000 people who worked at HM Factory Gretna in World War I. If you'd like to know more about that project and your chance to get involved if you want to, then you'd be very welcome to join us there. On March 22nd, we've got a great talk by Dr. Nina Baker on Scottish engineering, boilers, cars, ships, and female engineers, and that includes a look at Cochrane boiler from Annan if you're a comparative local to the museum. And then on April the 26th, we've got one on Mossbound Farewell, which is workers' writings and the creation of Mossbound Farewell magazine, which focuses on the workers at HM Factory Gretna in World War I, as much as this talk will, but that's with an emphasis on the writing they created themselves. On May the 21st, we're going to have an all-day conference on women's work in wartime, so speakers throughout the day, including Angela Woolaku as our keynote speaker. Our full programme is still to be confirmed, and there will be a charge for this conference, so unlike the others, that's not a free event. On June the 21st, our wonderful new research assistant Laura is going to deliver a talk on her PhD topic, which is on political activists and professional women, the extraordinary lives of Elise Bauman and Crystal Macmillan. So hopefully by that point she'll have completely finished her PhD and she'll be able to call herself Dr. Laura. I'm just going to quickly check my email because a couple of people have just messaged me to say Eventbrite didn't get through to them. Perhaps it went in their spam or their junk, and I can hear one or two just coming in. So if you'll just bear with me 1 minute, we'll start the talk in 30 seconds or so. No. Okay, luckily that was just more people booking other things through Eventbrite, so that's great. There's no one stuck and no one saying, why can't I get into this meeting? So let's make a start. Next slide, please, Laura, thank you. So I'm going to talk with you today about stories of love in wartime, with a particular focus on stories from the Devil's Porridge Museum collection. My name, as I said, is Judith Hewitt. I'm the manager of the Devil's Porridge Museum, and I also curated an exhibition a couple of years ago called Love in Wartime. And this card here, which I think kind of sums it up, is a beautiful Valentine's Day card with a sailor gazing lovingly into the eyes of his lady love. And I thought, what a romantic, beautiful picture. And on the back of it, I expected to read some really sentimental thing about lovers being parted by war. It actually says something like, "Dear Nana, don't forget the socks," on the back of it. So there you go. So let's move on to the next slide, please. So I work at the wonderful Devil's Porridge Museum. If you don't know it, it's just in Dumfries and Galloway. And it shares the story of HM Factory Gretna. And I'm not going to go into too much detail about what that is, but for some of you, I know some of you know it intimately and know everything about it, and perhaps more than me. But for those of you who don't know, I'll just give you a little bit of background information. So if we could have the next slide, please. The Devil's Porridge Museum. It's a great day out if you haven't been. I just thought I'd include some of these pictures. Kids love it. Everyone loves dressing up and having fun when they're allowed to and when COVID allows. So if you haven't visited, I do hope you'll come up and visit us. It's about World War I and World War II. But tonight we're going to focus on World War I. So next slide, thank you. So HM Factory Gretna, if you can see this map here, this is a modern day aerial photograph of the area where the museum is based. I'm currently speaking to you from Annan, if you can see that on the left hand side of your screen there. That's Annan, which is a large township. The factory actually occupied a stretch of land 9 miles long and 2 miles wide, stretching from Dornoch, which you can maybe just see on the one side of the arrow, to Longtown in England. And it was 3 miles wide from the Solway coast as far up as Kirkpatrick Fleming. And it included The townships of Eastriggs and Gretna, which were built to house the factory workers. And if you look carefully at this, you can still see the two main areas of the factory. The bit at the bottom of the arrow just underneath the museum, which is in Eastriggs, you can see the large Dornoch section of the factory, that unusual sort of V shape down there, just into the Solway. And just underneath the far end of the arrow, underneath Longtown, you can still see MOD Longtown, which is still there today. So this huge factory was built in World War One, HM Factory Gretna, His Majesty's Factory Gretna, for the production of one thing, which was cordite. So if you move on to the next slide, cordite in its raw form looked a bit like this. So I'm going to simplify it because we're not really going into the history of what HM Factory Gretna is, but I think almost everyone knows what gunpowder is and what it does, which blows up. Well, cordite was sort of a more modern replacement for gunpowder. It was a type of explosive, or even more technical term, it's a propellant, which was used inside every single bullet and shell that was used in World War One. In its raw form, cordite looks like this. It's white, it's lumpy, it's bumpy, and it was mixed in big pots like these ones here by young women. And when Sir Arthur Conan Doyle visited the factory in 1916, he saw young women mixing white, lumpy, bumpy stuff in big pots in Scotland, and he thought, porridge, but not the sort of porridge you eat, the devilish sort that when it's dried out into strips that look like spaghetti and put inside bullets or shells, it will explode at the enemy. So it's a porridge of a devilish kind. And that's what the name of the museum's about. That's why everyone was at HM Factory Gretna. They were there to make munitions. And by the middle of the war, over half of all of Britain's cordite was made at this huge factory complex. But what we're going to focus on are the people who were involved in that production rather than the processes. If you're particularly interested in how cordite was produced, or if the museum's the place for you, I'm not really going to go into it in too much detail here. What I am going to talk about are the people who found love amongst the chemical fumes, amongst the dangers and difficulties and darkness of the war. Somehow or other, even in this bleak and terrible time, and in this cold and wet part of Scotland, or it can be, or it is at the moment, in amongst all the miserableness of war, some people still found love, and there were human stories, which is what I want to share with you this evening. So on to the next slide, thank you. So the first story I want to share with you is kind of, in many ways, the typical one of HM Factory Gretna. If you look here, you'll see a gentleman standing and a lady sitting, and they are Margaret Mortimer and Norman Hudson. So Margaret Mortimer is dressed in the clothes of a munitions girl, and Norman Hudson was a chemist in the factory. He came all the way from Australia to work at HM Factory Gretna to mix munitions in World War One. Such was the need in World War One that workers were brought from all over the world, from all over the Commonwealth. They were headhunted to mix munitions and bring their expertise to HM Factory Gretna. While Norman Hudson came over from Australia to work at the factory, he met Margaret, or Meg Mortimer, and I think she's a rather beautiful young woman, and they fell in love. They married, and when the war ended, they were married, and after the wedding they moved to Australia, where they lived out their lives. So in many ways it's a typical office romance or business romance. They met while they were working together. And World War One was really one of the first times that lots of unmarried women worked closely with unmarried men. And arguably it was the birth of the sort of office romance or the workplace romance. So if we go on to the next slide, this is another picture of them together. So the museum has, and I've put little hearts on them in case you're wondering who's who. There's the two that fell in love while working in munitions. He a technical advisor and she a munitions girl. So the museum's got lots and lots of these photographs, and some of them we know a lot about and some of them we know very little about. And usually we know about them because the family donated them. So the family gave these in and says, there's my mum, there's my dad. Much as if you look at a school photograph or a class photograph, you can point out the people you know. We don't know a lot about the other people. Perhaps there are other people here who are in relationships. Perhaps there are sisters, perhaps there are friends. We don't know their feelings for each other, but we do at least have a document that they worked at the factory. So on to the next slide then, please. Another typical example is another munitions girl, Selby Bald. She worked at HM Factory Gretna during World War One, mixing the devil's porridge, working with the chemicals, the acids, the fumes that could discolour your skin, that could cause you to have a hacking, painful cough, that could cause your teeth to discolour and fall out, and could cause all sorts of other issues, including acid burns. There were fires. She worked in this difficult, dangerous situation. While she was working there, she met William Poole, who was from the Australian Army, and he became a shift chemist at Gretna. Now, what's interesting is quite a lot of the people who worked at HM Factory Gretna, they had technical expertise. So they were involved in the production of cordite, which is a propellant and a type of explosive. But they also, quite a lot of them, worked in the production of poison gas. And you can see why, really. If you had the technical expertise to make cordite, which involves complex mixing of chemicals and precision to make an explosive, then perhaps you would also have the skills to produce poison gas. So William Poole went to work at Avonmouth, which was one of the biggest mustard gas factories in Britain during World War One. While he was working there, he was actually gassed himself, which happened quite a lot during World War One because it was an experimental thing. I think the first time that mustard gas was used on the front, it actually poisoned the people who'd actually unscrewed, because initially it was in canisters. They unscrewed the canister to release the poison gas. The wind then changed and they gassed themselves. This poor young man was badly gassed, when he was himself was producing mustard gas, and he was never in good health afterwards. After the war, they also moved to Australia. So Eastriggs, where the museum is, if you're not familiar with it, if you ever do visit us, which I hope you will, at the Devil's Porridge Museum, when you enter Eastriggs, you'll see a little tiny sign. It's not very big, but it says Eastriggs, the Commonwealth Village. And Eastriggs is known as the Commonwealth Village because of the place names, the street names in Eastriggs. There's a document in the museum collection that says that HM Factory Gretna was a veritable Tower of Babel, because there were accents from all over the world and language from all over the world. So we've already had 2 Australians in our talk tonight, but people came from India, people came from South Africa, people came from Canada, people came from Ireland. We know there were Gaelic speakers working in the factory because they had an argument with some of the non-Gaelic speakers, so we know about them through that. And people came from all over the place. And Eastriggs, if you go there and visit it, the place names of the road names are places like Singapore Road, Delhi Road, Vancouver Avenue, the Rand, which is South African, and the Ridge, which was also South African. So they left behind the places they'd come from in the place names of Eastriggs. So if we move on to the next slide, here we have a picture of Selby Bald and William Poole, and again I put the hearts on them there so we can see who they are. So it's very difficult to know when you look at old photographs and actually think about the blood pumping and the heart fluttering and the feelings that people are experiencing, because they look quite stiff and staid, but obviously they were flirting and finding love and romance in the factory, as well as doing all their serious job of winning the war. So on to the next slide, please. This account I just had to share because it's just so charming. There was a gentleman who worked at the factory called Arthur Parkin, and he was a chemist as well. While he was stationed at HM Factory Gretna, he had a daughter, and he called her Gretna Parkin. And her father, Arthur Parkin, was from Australia. After the war, they moved back to Australia when little baby Gretna was about 2 years old at that point. Gretna Parkin went on to marry someone with the surname West, so she became Gretna West, and she became a very famous botanist in her own right. So people were falling in love, having children, having families, even in the midst of war, and some of them went on to become quite notable female pioneers, as is the case of little baby Gretna West. So next slide, please. So the origins of the exhibition of Love in Wartime and this theme, what really got me thinking about it was when I started working at Devil's Porridge Museum a few years ago. My grandparents actually met during World War II. My grandfather was in the RAF. He was an accountant, disappointed he couldn't be a pilot, but he was colourblind, so he couldn't. And my grandmother was in the WAF. So the Women's Auxiliary Air Force. And my grandfather saw my grandmother for the first time on an RAF base and started with the line, "I don't like your lipstick," was the first thing he ever said to her. And somehow from that, cheeky so-and-so that he was, they got married within a month. So it obviously got him off to the right start. They got married within a month, and they were married moderately happily for the next 50 odd years, and obviously I'm the result of that union, or part of that union. So that whole idea of people meeting during wartime and getting married and moving. My grandfather was from Cumbria, he moved down to Derbyshire to marry my grandmother. And it completely changed the whole course of his life. And I think we've already seen a couple of examples of people who, if they hadn't met that person, they probably would never have ended up in that part of the world or doing the things that they did and knowing the people they knew. So that sort of got me thinking about it. And then when I started going through the museum archive and finding all these stories of people who'd met and married, and seeing objects like the one on the left here, this postcard, obviously, this postcard suggests that this was quite a well-known phenomenon. This says at the bottom, obviously, on the sign on the wall says, "Notice, matches are not allowed." So you're not allowed to take matches, as in fire matches, into a munitions factory for obvious reasons. It would cause explosions. So matches are not allowed. But at the bottom it says, the only kind of matches that are allowed are love matches. So obviously it was quite a common thing, common enough for people to make a postcard commenting on it and joking about it and saying that it was well known that munition girls were falling in love with technicians and falling in love with the people they were working with. So going through these objects made me think there's a theme here that's interesting and unexplored. There's also all these brilliant family histories and unseen stories that haven't been shared, that we've got in our archive, but that aren't being made public or broadcast. And I also thought it shows a different side of the war, not the doom and gloom of the trenches, but something a bit more playful, a bit more human in some ways, and also one that strongly involves the women of the factory as well. Plus the museum's based near Gretna Green, so marriages just sort of naturally spring to mind, I suppose. So the large proportion of the women working at the factory were young and were unmarried, and they were generally described as the Gretna girls, which I know to a lot of people now, calling a young woman a girl is maybe not the done thing, but that's how they described themselves at the time, the Gretna girls. They were mostly aged 16 to 18, and they were mostly unmarried. So it's the time of life when really love is what's on your mind. I'm sure we can all remember that dimly, that was what life used to be like, perhaps for some of us. So on to the next slide, thank you. So this quote, I thought just, again, I just look at this picture of this lovely young woman, Eve Smith, and she gave a really long interview in the 1970s about her experiences in HM Factory Gretna. And she talks about all sorts of things, but this really stuck out for me. When our boyfriends were coming home from France, we only had to ask and we got our leave straight away. So this idea that, the girls who were working at home and in munitions, they were doing it, a lot of them, because they had brothers or lovers or husbands or fathers, even in some extreme cases, that might be fighting on the front line. And this coordination and this affection between the home front and the front is really prevalent in that. On the next slide then, thank you. And here's a few more sort of postcards from the museum's collection, showing this idea of the shell girl, and the little girl doing her makeup while looking into the shell as a reflective agent there on the left hand side. And then we've got the munitioneer's apology: from early morn till late at night I'm busy making these, so cannot get the time to write as often as I please, but all the same through the whole day through, you know I'm thinking, dear, of you. So even though we've got all these images of women doing all these very serious things, we don't know what's going on inside their heads. And if they're anything like a lot of young women and a lot of people, they might be thinking of those they love, those at danger, and so on. So next slide, thank you. So finding love in the factory. Was it easy to find love in the factory? Well, there was quite a widely reported what we would now call a moral panic at the start of World War One. Women being left alone, husbands going away, and their eyes might start to stray. Young women going to work in factories, leaving their parents and going to work in factories. And the whole idea of women working and women earning, it caused what's commonly described as a moral panic or a bit of moral concern. There was also something called Khaki Fever at the start of World War One, which was essentially the idea that young women would get intoxicated or go a little bit crazy at the sight of any young man in uniform, and therefore there might be lots of illegitimate children because they've got a bit of khaki fever. They're a bit excited at the thought of young men in uniform. So there was a lot of concern about this, and the Annandale Observer, which is the local paper for this region of Scotland, bemoaned the morals of the new towns of Eastriggs and of Gretna, and also that there were riotous groups of munition workers going into Annan and singing songs. And Carlisle in particular was an area that sort of was seen as being becoming a sort of a debauched place, not somewhere you'd want to go or send nice children, and certainly not nice girls. Nice girls wouldn't want to go there. So there was this concern that there was vast amounts of alcohol being consumed, that the Sabbath was being broken was a big concern on the Scottish side of the border, and that young women were being led astray. So the factory authorities took this quite seriously, and they built 5 churches for the factory workers. One of them is shown here. That still stands in Gretna. It's now Anvil Hall. It was originally the Roman Catholic church, but it's now Anvil Hall. But they built also YMCA, so Young Men's and Young Women's Christian Association huts, and mission huts as well. Not entirely sure how effectively this was all managed, but we'll maybe talk about that a little bit more. But they tried to introduce, a bit more discipline. The factory authority saw themselves as in loco parentis, so essentially they were the parents for the girls, and if the girls came as nice young women, they would leave as nice young women, not boozy, drinking, dance going, flighty young women. So as many of you might know, and it's really a subject for a whole other talk, as a result of this moral panic in this region of Scotland and the northwest of England, the government took control of the supply and distribution of all alcohol and part of the state management of alcohol scheme. Started in 1916 as an emergency measure to try and make sure there was less absenteeism and to protect the morals of the young women working. But it actually lasted until 1973 because it was quite a successful and lucrative thing for the government of this region. So the state management of alcohol is one factor in all of this story, which I don't really have time to go into here, maybe one for another night. So if we move on to the next slide, thank you. So there were lots of organised types of recreation for the workers at HM Factory Gretna. They put on scientific talks and they put on sort of like things on how to do your household finances and things like that. They generally weren't that well attended, but hat making sessions were well attended, and all the dances were also well attended. And here's a picture of the Border Hall in Gretna, inside and out. And this is a description from one of the young workers that I met my husband during the First World War. He worked in the factory, but I really met him when he went to the dances at Annan. Quite a lot of people met and married as a result of working in the factory. We married after the war in 1919 and lived in Halifax Road, Eastrigg. So even though some people moved to the other side of the world as a result of their marriage and as a result of the war, some people stayed in the local area. And in fact, some of our volunteers have family connections with the factory to this day. On to the next slide, thank you. So this is just a dance program from Melbourne Avenue, Eastriggs, which if you know the area, it's the Central Hall in Eastriggs. It's now where the Spa Shop is in Eastriggs, I believe, in the Melbourne playing fields. It was the 24th of October 1917. I just included it really just to show that there were these official dances, but also just to draw your attention to the dance at the end, which I'd never heard of before, called mixed pickles. So I don't know what that involves, but it sounds like fun. So on to the next one, thank you. So the cinema also was an area where men and women met and went on dates and things like that. This is Gretna Cinema, which was built for the workers in HM Factory Gretna and still stands today, although it's no longer a cinema. Gretna Cinema, they showed lots and lots of different films. If we show the next one, next slide, please. And there was quite a concern. This is showing an advert for a film at Gracie's Banking Cinema in Annan from the Annandale Observer during World War I. And there's The Perils of Divorce, was a problem play unfolding a unique story. And there was quite a few of these sorts of, the plays and films that showed. There was one called A Munition Worker's Torment or something along those lines, or The Tragedy of the Munition Girl, which was shown at one of them. So there's quite a lot of these sorts of things that sort of comment on the dangers of modern life and the feeling that, young girls might get led astray while working. But the biggest issue was really that the feeling that the cinema might be a distraction for the girls. And might lead to absenteeism and them not going to work because they're too interested in the cinema. And I also read something where someone said that young women watching films gives them an unrealistic idea of what marriage and love will be like, which I think is just mind-numbingly obvious and still true today. I mean, who watches a film really and thinks that's what my life is going to be like? It'll always be Mr. Darcy or Hugh Grant or whoever it is, and they'll always be charming and delightful, or Cary Grant or whoever that you like, it's just, this idea that the whole idea of young women watching the cinema will give them the wrong idea of what romance would be like. So there was quite a bit of debate in the factory. Should there be a cinema? Should they watch these films? And they came down on the side that yes, they should have it, and that there should be educational films and there should be propaganda films. So like the Battle of the Somme film was shown at one point. Birth of the Nation was also shown. The KKK film, The American Hit, was shown at one point as well in Annan, I believe. So that's just a little bit about the cinema, but the main issue at the cinema was that young women shouldn't be on their own in it. And the Women's Police Service, if we just move on to the next slide, actually used to patrol the back of the cinema. So the Women's Police Service would patrol the back of the cinema and make sure no one was up to any hanky-panky. So they would go back there with a torch and just make sure nothing was going on that shouldn't be going on. So this idea of women working in wartime, it's many of the young women were away from home for the first time with money in their pockets and meeting new people. And I, in some respects, you think it sort of sounds a little bit like for some of the young women, it sounds a bit like going off to university and meeting people the same age, living in hostels, going out, having fun. Obviously, there was a war on and it was quite serious as well. But maybe move the next slide. Office online frame. I don't know what that means, Laura, do you? See what happens. So there was this moral concern. You can switch to me sharing if you want, see if that helps. Ooh. Sorry, everyone, we're just having a slight technical issue with the PowerPoint. Just bear with us. So I was trying to say really that there was this moral concern that the young women might get led astray by this, and so therefore the factory authorities decided to employ 150 women police to monitor the girls' behaviour. Now, one of the main roles that they had was to actually police the young women as they entered and exited the factory to make sure they weren't stealing anything or giving away any government secrets or wearing inappropriate clothing that could cause fires or could cause issues, or taking one man tried to take in a pipe to have a smoke. One young woman was caught snuggling in some knitting. So that was their main job, was to stop people at the gate and just check them. But the women's police service also functioned in another way, to keep an eye on the morals of the young women, to check the back of the cinema, to check the women only railway carriages, and to make sure that the curfew was enforced and that the young women were back by 10 o'clock on most nights, I think it was. So there was a concern that some of the more innocent younger girls would be led astray by the older, more experienced, or the rough girls, as one munitionette described them. So nothing much changes there, I think, really. Lots of people still see that as an issue. But some women were already married, some had soldier boyfriends, and some had found love while they were working there. But whatever their situation, their welfare was of concern to the factory officials, as well as to all the religious organisations that ministered to the workers. And this picture on the right here is a picture from Mossban Farewell magazine. I've actually got a talk coming up all about Mossban Farewell magazine. It's a brilliant source of information for the factory, and it shows a sort of glam munition girl, and at the bottom it's sort of a jokey thing saying this is what the costumes, the uniforms could be like, you know, if the young ladies were allowed to accessorize them with a dainty little handbag and a bow and things like that. So the uniform is very strictly enforced for health and safety reasons, on the whole. So if you move on to the next slide, please. So this whole idea of moral panic and concern generally is borne out by these two documents. On the one hand, this is an excerpt from the Annandale Observer commenting on the birth rate and the marriage rate. During both World War I and World War II, the marriage rate increased. The birth rate didn't actually, I don't think, but the marriage rate did. And there was a real concern, maybe a bit like my grandma and granddad, you know, they meet with the charming line, and then a month later they're married. I mean, they couldn't have known each other very well, but their marriage did last. But there was a real concern that people would marry in haste and repent at their leisure. So you meet someone and he seems like a nice chap, or she seems like a nice girl, but you're stuck with them for life. So there was a real concern that that might happen. There was also a concern, as this document here says, this is an excerpt from a birth register, and it says Agnes Douglas, and underneath it says in brackets illegitimate, and she was born at Butterdale's Huts in Dornoch, which is near Eastriggs, and that's the factory site. So this young woman who worked at the factory had an illegitimate child, and there were several instances of illegitimate children. The factory authorities did build a maternity unit, so obviously people were having children in enough numbers to merit that facility. So that was what they were concerned about, and it definitely happened. So on to the next slide then, thank you. So here's a postcard from the museum's collection. I miss you in the morning and miss you so at night. The days are long without you and nothing seems just right. So you've got to think of all these young people being separated and the young men off at the front. So the factory had a social and recreation department, as I've mentioned, which put on dances, films and activities. The cinema, as I've said, was seen as particularly dangerous, and it might be used as a place for liaisons. Which I thought was the point anyway. But anyway, so the women's police service were often found there, and the matrons in the hostels and the women's police service were sometimes seen as killjoys, but they saw themselves as protecting the virtue of the girls and warding off the advances of predatory males. There is one case of an accusation of rape that took place when a man entered a woman-only carriage in the night on the night shift. So they did see themselves as, we are actually trying to protect the women from predatory men, and sort of, you know, the sort of lower class criminal element, as they were typified, that might be working in the labouring aspects of the factory as well. So there were curfews and train travel was limited, particularly to limit access to Carlisle, which is seen as the sort of the Sodom and Gomorrah of this area. So on to the next slide, thank you. So I just thought I'd show you this photograph, which is a beautiful photograph, I think, really lovely to see. This is the workers getting off the train at Gretna. Probably they've come from Carlisle, because a lot of them did stay in Carlisle, as well as Eastriggs and Gretna and Annan and lots of other places around here. I like the gentleman in the middle in the hat with his spade going about his work, obviously going somewhere out different from everybody else. All the girls seem to be going in that direction, so that must be where the factory is. But the two people I've highlighted with these big red arrows, if you see them, they are members of the Women's Police Service. So you can see them there on the station, patrolling, monitoring, checking on what's happening and segregating the sexes, which is their role on the police station. So on to the next slide, thank you. So a few more stories of people who found love while working in the factory. Now we've got a few of the themes of the talk and the exhibition. So these pictures show Minnie and Alice Morton. So they're the two girls who look a bit alike on the left-hand side here. And then the girl with the bunches is Lily Hurst. They all lived together in one of the huts. So Minnie was 16 when she and her sister Alice moved to work at HM Factory Gretna from County Durham. Lots of people came from the northeast to work in the factory. They came from all over Britain. I think the furthest I've seen is a girl who came from Cornwall. One came from the Isle of Man. We know people came from Aberdeenshire, and as I said earlier, we knew there were Gaelic speakers in the factory, so they must have come from some region of Britain that speaks Gaelic. So while Minnie and her sister were working at the factory, they became good friends with Lily Hurst. And at the end of the war, Minnie married Lily's brother. So another typical, seems very modern, you marry your friend's brother, is how it goes back. So they ended up living in Eastriggs in Rand Square for a long time. And we know this story because their son visited the museum in 2010 and shared it with us. So that's how we know a lot of these. And it's wonderful, the genealogists out there and what they share with us. On to the next screen, thank you. This account, I didn't actually know very much about when I did the exhibition, and it led to a really interesting line of inquiry and for future research in the museum. So this is James Dugdale Rothwell and Sarah Ethel Wright. James, as you can tell by his uniform, was in the Royal Engineers, and all I knew at the time when I did this was that he was a soldier and she was a munition worker. That was pretty much all I knew, and I knew their name. And that was kind of how I presented it in the exhibition. Their daughter, I think she might actually be their granddaughter. Anyway, she's spoken with me quite a lot in a lot of detail. And she's done a lot of research. She saw that we were looking into this. I actually contacted her and we've had a lengthy conversations about it. And he was actually, and she told me this information, that he was in the Royal Engineers. And during World War I, the Royal Engineers created a new position, which was called a corporal chemist, so a new sort of rank in the army. He wasn't a corporal, he was a corporal chemist. And the Royal Engineers worked in the production of poison gas for use on the front line in France. So another chemist who did that. James was actually gassed and wounded on the front line. Now, when I initially read this, I thought that he was a soldier who was gassed and wounded, as many soldiers were while fighting the trenches. But he was another one of these cases of someone who was actually gassed by his own gas. While poisoning others, he poisoned himself. And there are lots and lots of connections between the Royal Engineers and HM Factory Gretna, which is something I want to look into a little bit more as we continue with our research. There's a reference to 20 members of the Royal Engineers joining the factory on one day. And whether or not they were coming here to do, I'm not entirely sure. But it's an interesting thing we could look into in future. In 1916, he married Sarah Ethel Wright and they lived together on 2 Dunedin Road, Eastriggs. and their son James Thomas was born there. Oh, and obviously the lady I spoke to was the daughter of James Thomas, so she was their granddaughter, and she's done a lot of research about where he worked in France, the factory that he was employed in, and also this role of corporal chemist. But she's yet to uncover more connections with HM Factory Gretna, but she has uncovered other people who worked at HM Factory Gretna who were Royal Engineers. So there's quite a few members of the Royal Engineers who were at HM Factory Gretna. And what's interesting is they didn't leave the Royal Engineers and come and work at the factory. They were still in the Royal Engineers while they worked at the factory. So there's obviously quite a large military presence at HM Factory Gretna. So that's one for future research. On to the next slide, please. That's their certificate of marriage, which we have a copy of in the museum. Next slide, thank you. So this account's quite different because this gentleman is Mr. Core, and he was a section manager of the nitrocotton drying area at the factory. It was quite a high up position in the factory. He actually met a young local woman called Kate Bryson, who lived in the post office at Dornoch, which I believe stood before the factory, so it's older than the factory, and I think her family were there before the factory was built. She was originally worked in the post office with her family. When the school was built at Eastriggs, she was one of the first people to work at the school because they built the townships of Eastriggs and Gretna to house the workers. They also built the schools to help the children. And there's a whole community here. And she worked at the school when it opened and is described as ample, well qualified and capable. And she later married Mr. Core at the end of the war and wrote a history of the factory in 1966. So long before the museum or anything like that existed, she was a local historian interested in the history of the area. And he obviously married her and settled in the area. So that's another person who stayed after the factory left. And if we go on to the next one, we can see a picture of her as a school teacher. She's actually the lady sitting down on the front row with her hands crossed there. So she was quite a well-known person around this area, and her husband was and came here and met her because of HM Factory Gretna. Next slide, thank you. So this story is Margaret Jane Sutherland and James Casey. We don't actually have photographs of them, so I used a general photograph showing women working in HM Factory Gretna. You can see, if you look carefully, a question that people often ask is, did they not wear masks and did they not wear gloves? Well, you would think they would, and in the official accounts of what you should do, it does say you should wear gloves and you should use a rake. If you can see behind her head, she's got a stick there. That is, you are supposed to use a rake to stir things. You are supposed to wear gloves. And you can see here, they are wearing some kind of face mask, although I know now we all know a lot better that's not going to do very much. It should be a bit more up here. But they are wearing face masks. But this case here, Margaret worked in the factory and she married an Irish navvy by the name of James Casey from Dublin. So a lot of people came over from Ireland to work at HM Factory Gretna as well. And the majority of them were people who helped construct the factory, so-called navvies, or from the term navigator, because they originally were known for building canals. But long after the war, she died as a result of inhaling poisonous fumes from her war work. So there are cases of women who had terrible health effects from working in the factory, and this is one of them. However, there's not really enough information to make general statements about whether or not it was all a result of the factory work. There's just not. We don't know enough about everybody and what happened to them after they worked at the factory to make that kind of general statement. But that's an area again for future study. If we move on to the next slide, thank you. So this is a really interesting family story, and I appreciate that picture's come out a little more faded than maybe it should have done. But there's a gentleman in the middle with a rather impressive walrus sort of moustache, and his name is William Mitchell, and his job description is ganger. which is a gang organizer. So they were responsible for organizing gangs of navvies, gangs of construction workers to build the factory. He moved to Gretna with his whole family, and you can see them all there, and they look very Victorian, although this photograph is from World War One. So that he brought them all to Gretna when he obtained the position. And his son, William Robert, who you can see on the front left-hand row with his hat, his cap on his knee, was in the army. And they all lived in the huts near the factory. So all of the people in this photograph lived in one of the huts on Butterdale's Road, which is near Eastriggs. And if you move on to the next slide, while they were all based there, the whole family, they got very friendly with some of the other families in the other huts, and they all seem to have intermarried. So it becomes very complicated, and I'm not going to try and explain it to you. I've had lengthy discussions with their grandson about it, and he explains it all. He understands it all perfectly. This is uncle this, auntie that, auntie the other. But they're all essentially from like about 3 families, the Pearsons and the Mitchells and another family. And they all lived next door to each other in these huts. They all worked at Gretna. They were all based in Eastriggs and worked at HM Factory Gretna in World War One. So they're all recorded on the documents as living there. And then in 1921, so 3 years after the war ended, they're all in Middlesbrough. So they've obviously all moved to Gretna, built the factory, then moved on to somewhere else, and they've intermarried and taken this huge extended family with them. So this is William here in the uniform, and he met Florence Pearson while she was working in the factory, and she was living in the huts as well with her family. And so they all intermarried. And if you go on to the next slide, I found these photographs that this gentleman, the children, the grandson of these 2 people had donated. I got in touch with him, and he said, "Oh, I've got hundreds more photographs if you want to see them." So this led to this wonderful photograph that he gave us, showing a marriage which actually took place at Dornoch Church in 1917. So Dornoch is the parish of that Eastriggs is in, or was in, until they built their own parish church during the war. And this is the marriage of George Mitchell and Eva Alice Barker. So this is another case of intermarriage. It's very, very complicated, but they're all there. They're all here in Eastriggs. If we move on to the next one, they're all then in Middlesbrough. And the person who donated this to the museum, this photograph, said every single person in this photograph was either at Eastriggs during World War One, so based at HM Factory Gretna, or the children, one of them was born at the factory. So this huge whole factory connection, and these people met each other, and then their whole life moved on to some other big project, which I thought was just a fascinating glimpse into how families operated in the past, and how people met each other, and how these big family units sort of came about as a result of war. So if we move on to the next slide, thank you. So some people who worked at the factory were already married, such as this lady here. This is Agnes Bar Ochenlos. She was a medical professional who graduated from the University of Glasgow in 1911. She was a hugely successful medical professional. Not only was she going to university at a time when most women weren't, but she also appeared 9 times on the prize lists and achieved first-class certificates in anatomy and surgery. After graduation, she worked as a doctor and moved to South Africa. And when she was in South Africa, she married a young man called Gusta Lundholm and gave birth to their first child in 1915. And this is the start of the Lundholm saga, which their great-grandson spent years compiling and then donated to the museum, and we have in the archive all about his family and how it came to be. So if we move on to the next slide. This is Gusta Lundholm. He was a chemist, and his father was an associate of Alfred Nobel. His family was originally from Sweden, but had lived in Scotland for many years before the war. And both Gusta's father and mother were British citizens. Gusta travelled all around the world, Edinburgh, London, Zurich, then to South Africa, and he worked in the South African Explosive Company at Modderfontein in the Transvaal. As did a lot of people who worked at HM Factory Gretna. But prior to the war, they worked in the production of dynamite for the gold and diamond mines in South Africa. On to the next slide, thank you. And this married couple, so you've got Agnes, a successful doctor, and Gusta, a hugely talented and in-demand dynamites, explosives expert and chemist, moved into number 9, the Ridge, Eastriggs with their son, their baby son, and both contributed to the war in their own way. If you don't know Eastriggs or Gretna or the whole area I'm talking about, and hopefully someday you'll visit us, and you'll see that these houses here still stand. Unfortunately, the steam-powered car that you can see just in the middle there, the big sort of engine, no longer is there. But these houses are still there, and people still live in these wonderful World War I houses where these people that were built for the factory workers. So Gusta worked in the plant in the HM Factory Gretna, and Agnes, if we move on to the next slide, helped with the medical care. She was a medical officer in the factory throughout the war, and when the King and Queen visited the factory in 1917, Agnes was actually one of the people who was introduced to the King and the Queen. So there she is in the suit on the front there, with her hair piled up like that. On to the next slide, thank you. So after the end of the war, they returned to South Africa and had another son. And then in 1929, they returned to Scotland, and Gusta worked at ICI Ardea, just up in Ayrshire, as did a lot of people who worked at the factory actually ended up working for ICI, which is in Industrial Chemicals Incorporated, I believe. There was an ICI Powerfoot as well, if you're from around here, so you might know about that. Gusta was then known as a man who was lovely, had an agreeable personality, enjoyed the opera, sailing and tennis, and Agnes was a very helpful person and helped lots of injured people. And they both died well into life in 1969 and 1972 respectively. So it's a very interesting marriage there, and a very, two big personalities in the factory who were married to each other. On to the next slide. 2 other big personalities who were married and contributed to the factory. G. Bramwell Evans, if you listen to the radio in the 50s and 60s, you might have heard a program called Romany of the BBC. It was like a nature program where he talked about the natural world. Well, his real name was G. Bramwell Evans, and he started out not as a BBC personality, which he became known as a very beloved BBC personality, but he was originally in World War I a Methodist minister from Carlisle, and he lived in Carlisle with his wife, son, and Cocker Spaniel, Rack. And when the factory was built, Bramwell Evans, like lots of people, was concerned that about the morals of the munition workers. So he persuaded the government authorities that there should be a building for a ministry for him to do missionary work. So he persuaded them to build a mission hut for him to use as a Methodist minister. He then bought a car and travelled backwards and forwards from Carlisle to Gretna to supervise the production of that. And then eventually he persuaded his wife to move to Gretna to minister to the workers. Now, just to give you an idea of what that might be like, there was a description in the museum's archive that says, if you imagine Gretna, it was like all the building materials from all around the world had been dumped in a muddy puddle and stirred with a spoon. Basically, he's saying, let's go and minister to the godless heathens in Gretna. And his wife eventually said, okay, let's leave our nice life in Carlisle, buy a car out of our own pocket, and go and minister to these Irish hard-drinking navvies who don't want to know. That was her sort of attitude, as is described on the next slide here. So she said, she wrote a book about him in later life. Her name was Eunice Evans. And she said, we packed up our camp beds and belongings into the old car and arrived. To me, our new home looked very uninviting, for it stood in a rough, desolate spot far removed from habitation. My husband had omitted to tell me that the building was only half finished, that there was neither heating nor lighting, and that the windows had not been put in. How we existed those next few weeks, I do not know. When the king and queen visited the munitions works, my husband was included in the invitation to meet them, and I had great difficulty in persuading him the dirty old suit he was wearing would not do. So she motored to Carlisle. She made him go to Carlisle, get a proper suit, put it on to meet the king and queen. But he forgot his best shoes, so he had to go and meet the king and queen in his plaster-covered ones. So anyway, she complains quite a lot about her husband. He sounds, in some respects, I know it's might sound familiar to a lot of married people, perhaps, shall we say, or married women. He moved there, no real concern for her. He was on his mission to save the souls of the people of Gretna. And later on, they had a very, very loving and, a sort of spicy marriage, to seem a bit like Catherine Hepburn and people like that. Very, very Spencer Tracy, very sort of, big personality, shall we say, but obviously very affectionate. And she wrote this lovely account of his life through the years of Romany. He was called Romany because he was of Romany descent. So his ancestors were traveling people. So on to the next slide, please. So here's a fun little story for you, a few little anecdotes. This is Charles Wright. He was a technical chemist in the factory, and he was a single man when he started there, and obviously a bit of a flirt. And the young women, we've got hundreds of photographs in the factory of young women posing in their uniforms. And I often wonder, like, what were they for? Why did people take them? And is it just to show your family and show your friends, or was it the equivalent of a selfie back in the day? But one instance we know of is that the young women in the factory used to give their photographs to Charles Wright. And obviously before he was married, he used to take them home and keep them. I don't know what he did with them, but he used to keep them. But then when he was married, he would come home with them in his pockets, and his wife would go crazy with jealousy that he was bringing home all these photos of these 16 to 18-year-old munitions girls who she thought were flirting with him. And his son actually said that even when he was a child, they I think it was like in the 40s, that she still wouldn't let them talk. Anytime he brought up the factory, she would say, no, we're not talking about that factory and all the women who worked there, who she still had contempt for all these years later. On to the next slide, and I'll give you a bit more scandal. This is a case of bigamy at HM Factory Gretna. There were at least 2 cases of bigamy that we know of. So people moving around Britain, some of them conveniently forgot that they were already married when they arrived somewhere else. So this is Jane Doherty, who arrived at HM Factory Gretna, and she'd forgotten she was already married. She had a husband and little children in Ireland. She left them, moved to Glasgow, then moved to HM Factory Gretna, and then married a policeman without telling him that she was already married and had children back home. She was actually put in prison for a month for that. And the last we know of her is that the policeman who she married bigamously was still visiting her in prison. So perhaps he was forgiving her. Another case was a 46-year-old man. He moved to Gretna to work in 1917. He supposedly received a letter that said his wife had died. He wrote a letter back to check if she died, never heard anything, so just assumed she was dead, and didn't ask about, I think, the 3 children that she had and she was looking after. And he married a 20-year-old hostel maid instead. But then it was later found out that his thorough search for his wife hadn't been that thorough. She wasn't dead. And she was quite angry that he'd married someone else and half her age as well. So he was put in prison actually for a year. So the punishment was more harsh for him than for the woman. So there's at least 2 cases of bigamy that we know of. If we move on to the next slide, this is a case, a really interesting little story. This is Martin Masters. Again, as a result of doing this exhibition, I actually found out a great deal more about him. His family weren't sure why he was at this party, but I've managed to find out why. So Martin was a South African in the armed forces, as you can see here. And in July 1919, he was at a peace celebration to celebrate the end of the war and the signing of the Treaty of Versailles and everything like that at Border Hall in Gretna. While he was there celebrating and smoking cigars and drinking and having all these sorts of things, his wife gave birth to their daughter Joyce. And all of the people who were at the thing signed and wrote messages on the menu for this. So it's just a nice little story of married life during the war. I actually found out that he was at the factory. His family weren't sure if he'd just been there by accident, if he'd just been invited to the peace celebration, or if he actually had connections with the factory. He was actually an engineer in the factory, but another engineer who was still a member of the armed forces while working at HM Factory Gretna. I found another photograph of him with the engineering section, which his family were really pleased to see. So if we move on to the next slide, this is the copy of the menu, which shows the menu that they had here for the peace celebration, HM Factory Gretna, at the Border Hall in 1919. The menu, roast beef, blah, blah, blah. But I like the bit at the bottom where it says that they then had a smoking concert, which I'm not entirely sure what that is, but it sounds great. And all of these signatures here are eminent people connected with the factory, including at the very bottom there, J.C. Burnham, who was the superintendent of the factory, so one of the highest up in the factory, and who actually came all the way from India to work in the factory. So on to the next slide. So this is an account of a soldier. So this young munitions girl, Isabel Gertrude Beatty, she met James Leach Kirk, and he was stationed in Carlisle Castle, and he was invalided out of the army. So quite a lot of the young women married invalided soldiers, and this is just one example of that, which I have got a bit more to say about, but I'm conscious of the time. So we'll go on to the next one. Thank you. And this is Jemima Cawson. If she's actually the girl on the far right of your screen, the sort of tall, elegant girl perched on what looks like it might be a tree stump or something like that. This is a really sad story, and you have to think in the war there must have been a lot of people, a lot of these young women who actually knew people who died at the front. So this is Jemima Courson from Ayr. She'd met Francis Courson, who's on the other side of the picture, who was in the Royal Scots Fusiliers. They were married in October 1914, and he was actually killed that month. So he was killed in the very early days of the war, and she was a young widow. They don't know where he died. There's no known grave for him. His body was never found, but his name appears on the Menine Gate. Jemima then came to the factory to work as a widow in munitions. So she lost someone so early and so young in the war, and suffered throughout. You can imagine the grief that she must have experienced. So on to the next slide. This is another young woman who worked in the factory. Her name was Elizabeth Ann Story, or Bessie. She lived a good life there, 1897 to 1982. May we all have such a great long life. And before the war, she worked in Temperance Bar and then moved to Gretna in 1916. On to the next slide, thank you. She met, we don't know how she met, but she met and married William Orwin Hall, and there he is in his naval uniform, or his merchant navy uniform. William was joined the Navy as a boy, and then during the war, his ship and crew were loaned to the New Zealand Navy, and he travelled all around the world during the war as part of the Merchant Navy. In October 1918, William came back to the UK and was based at Scapa Flow. Unfortunately, he caught the Spanish flu and died very quickly of that, as so many people did. And that's another talk, how many people at HM Factory Gretna died of the Spanish flu. This photograph of them together, it isn't thought that they ever saw each other again after this photograph was taken on their wedding day. So it's believed that they'd never saw each other again, that they were separated. He was posted to Scapa Flow and died there. Now, this photograph was included, if we go on to the next slide, in an article that appeared about the exhibition in the Sunday Post. You can see it in the top right-hand corner there. And this article was in the Sunday Post about the factory and about the exhibition. And someone got in touch with the museum and said, "How come you've got my great uncle's photograph? Who gave you that?" And I said, "Well, the lady who's in it had children, and it was her children that gave it, grandchildren that gave it to us. And he said, well, our family have got this because they were William Orwin Hall's family. And Bessie Story's family had actually given the photograph to the museum. And actually, one really nice outcome was they were actually able to get in touch with each other as a result of this. And she'd remarried and had children, and his brother had passed down the story through his family. So it was really nice that this exhibition actually managed to connect people from the factory as well. So if we move on, just coming towards an end now, these are some photographs of the exhibition. That's me there when the exhibition was in place, with a wedding dress that we actually had on display, which was made out of net curtains. We've got loads of stories from World War II, which we don't have time for, but there was a whole section in the exhibition on love in a ration. So this idea of making, like Scarlett O'Hara, making your wedding dress out of net curtains. And on the right hand side there is our dearly missed friend from the museum, Sheila Ruddock, whose mother's wedding dress was on display in the exhibition. She got married in 1940, I think it was 40 or 41, in Annan, and that was her wedding dress that we had on display, along with all the other documents that went with it too. On to the next slide. We also had lots of other things on display. These were the postcards that belonged to one of our trustees, and it was actually a series of postcards sent by this man, Benjamin Pearson. They were loaned to the museum by his granddaughter for the exhibition, and they had all these beautiful love postcards that actually had loving messages on the back from the front to the wife back home, and some of them had drawings that the children had done and things. It's absolutely charming pictures to be able to share those real stories. On to the next slide. We also had a series of different postcards like this one here, just showing that love and separation were big themes in World War I that maybe people don't think about, that what it was actually like to send someone you loved or to see someone you love put themselves at such risk and in such a dangerous place. And on to the next one, there's just a couple more examples of these sorts of themes: kiss me goodbye, love that wilt not let me go, this idea of separation, longing, fear, loss, and the woman's experience of war as well as the man's experience of war. If you go on to the next one, please. So I'm just going to finish up with a World War II happy story, because it got a bit dark there with people being widowed and lost and things. So we did have some stories from World War II, but I haven't really incorporated them. But this is a lovely little story, this beautiful picture of a lady from Easteriggs, which is where Devil's Porridge Museum is based. Her name's Etty Wilsingham, and she joined the war effort at age 16, which I think she lied about her age to get the job. And she secured a job working at Easteriggs Ammunition Depot in 1942. While she was there, she met Arthur, who was a soldier in the Ordnance Corps, assigned to the different stores in there. And every so often, he would come and slip her a bar of chocolate while she was working. So while she was stacking the munitions, he would give her a bit of chocolate. And she said, what with rationing and chocolate being so scarce, I was won over. We married in 1945 after the war of Germany ended. So sometimes it's the simple things like it's Valentine's Day, or it was yesterday, a bit of chocolate, bit of affection, and makes all the difference, even in the deep, dark times of war. So if we just move on to the next slide. So thank you very much for listening. And just before I finish talking, I'll just tell you about, if you've been inspired by all these stories and thought, oh, there's so much more to find out, because there really, really is. We're always doing research at the museum. We know a lot, but we want to know more. There were 30,000 workers at HM Factory Gretna, and we don't know about the half of them. We know about hundreds, not thousands. We're now working on a project to research as many people as we can, and we're looking for volunteers to help us with that research, with database entry, and with sharing that research through Wikipedia, online outreach, and in real life sessions with schools, young people in the community. If you'd like to find out more, you can join us on March the 10th for a talk about it. If you come along to that, don't worry, you're not signing up for anything. You can just listen if you want to and see maybe if you'd like to get involved. I know lots of people getting a bit stir crazy with lockdown continuing forever. So if you'd like to try something new, you'd be very welcome to join us. And just look on our Eventbrite or our Facebook or wherever it is you found out about this talk to find out about that one as well. So if we move on to the final slide, we've got this lovely postcard in the museum collection, which is again another play on words of the idea of girls making shells. And much like the shell, the girl's heart is dangerous, handled with great care, highly explosive and easily broken. So that's lovely. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions, you'd be very welcome to either put them in the comments, or you can sort of wave at us or put your hand up if you know how to do that with the raise hand function. I'd be happy to answer a few questions if you want to. And if you've had enough and you want to go, you're very welcome to leave as well. So thank you very much for coming. So let's have a look at the chat and let's see what we've got. So thank you so much. The museum is one of our favourite places. Thank you. Can't wait for it to reopen. Neither can we. We're very ready to reopen when the time's right. Thank you so much for the insight. That's great. Thank you. Very interesting. Is it possible to tell us more about the pay and salaries? That's a very good question. So I can't remember the statistics off the top of my head. But the majority of young women who worked at HM Factory Gretna had either worked as domestic servants, or had worked as farm labourers, or had worked in other factories. So we know, for example, some worked in biscuit factories in Carlisle and things like that before working at HM Factory Gretna. I think that the pay that they received was at least a third higher than they would receive in those other means of employment, and in some cases the pay they received at HM Factory Gretna was double what they would have received at other places of employment. It changes quite a lot as the war goes on, which is why I struggle to remember the exact, like, how many pence they got paid, you know, because inflation during the war, prices changed quite a lot, but it was roughly a third to a double on top of what they would normally be paid. And there is a disparity between what women were paid and what men were paid. As you can imagine, the women were paid less. The women generally did the labouring jobs, whereas the men did the more technical expertise jobs. But even if women were doing the same job, they got paid less than the men, which I know is an issue still today. So hopefully that helps, but it's a whole, again, there's so many talks that could come out of tonight that I could go on and on. So lots of nice comments. Thank you so much for all the positive comments. People saying thank you from someone from New York. That's amazing. So hello all the way to New York, and I'm really glad that you joined us and you heard about our museum. And great, yeah, to hear people looking forward to visiting. Of course, to the person from America, we never even mentioned people from America, but the main person behind the HM Factory Gretna was actually an American, KB Quinnen, which is another talk. So thank you to the person from Somerset who has stopped twice, and oh, brilliant, and you heard about the museum, and thank you very much. I wonder what happened after World War One. That's a great question. As you know, a lot of people genuinely believed that it was the war to end all wars and there would not be a need for such a factory in future. However, there were people who said they would like to try and keep the production of munitions going to some extent, but the factory itself was actually closed down finally in 1924, and they actually sold all of the plants and as much as everything they could. They tried to sell everything to try and recoup some of the loss that they made. And there was never a factory of that scale again in Britain as a result of it. And when World War II was known to be on the horizon, with appeasement having seemingly failed, there were moves to try and reopen HM Factory Gretna, but it never amounted to anything. Munitions production in World War II was quite different from World War I. It wasn't done as much by the state, it was done by companies such as ICI. So it never actually materialized at Eastriggs and Gretna. But there were these ammunition depots, which we have a large display about in the museum if you ever do come and visit. So will your project cover the techs, people from different Commonwealth countries? Yes, definitely. We're interested in anyone who worked at HM Factory Gretna, male, female, wherever in the world they're from. We just want to know as much as possible. Including, we'd like to involve people who might think they have family connections and would like to know more about their family's connections. That's great. Thank you. Thank you. Post-lockdown bucket list. Great. Were there rules against romance with someone of higher rank in the factory? Thank you, David John Ritchie. I wonder if that might be Alistair Ritchie asking that question, but thank you very much for the question. So were there rules against it? No, not really. I think it was just taboo. I don't think there were actually caste rules in Britain since sort of the Middle Ages. You know, I don't think anyone could say you can't marry this person since the Middle Ages. But there would be sort of like, I think it might be frowned upon, but not illegal. So yeah, I don't think there's any cases of where you couldn't marry someone. It's just if your family and society would look at it in a certain way. An interesting talk. And someone was interested in the families that moved to Middlesbrough. Oh yeah, and someone else went to work. Your grandfather went to work after Eastergs. So did they work at HM Factory Gretna, Peter Monroe? Is that
yes? Yep, that's right.
Yeah, they did. All right, wonderful. So I can talk to you. That's nice. So so what was their name? Sorry.
Well, it was Harry Lowe, and his wife was Elizabeth, and she was a Gaelic speaker.
Oh right.
I don't know whether she worked, but she was a teacher, so she probably didn't work. But he moved to Dorman Long at Middlesbrough, and I've always wondered why.
Yeah, I wonder why. I feel like the fact that they went from working at HM Factory Gretna en masse to work at Middlesbrough, I always thought they assumed there might have been another major construction operation happening, and it was just they moved from construction to construction.
Well,
now it makes me wonder if it was some sort of munitions.
You mentioned that some people went to work at ICI in Dumfriesshire.
Oh dear, yeah.
And so possibly other people went to work for Dorman Long, which was a subsidiary of ICI in Middlesbrough. So that would be an interesting. I mean, there may be some reason for that. They needed people with those things. I mean, my grandfather was a chemist.
All right.
And I believe he was a senior chemist. And he certainly told me a lot of stories about his work at Eastergs.
Oh, wonderful. Have you been in touch with the museum before? Or have you?
I came to the opening of the museum.
Oh, did you? Lovely. Well, if you wanted to, you should have my email from the Eventbrite ticket. It's manager@devilsporridge.org.uk. I'm sure we would love to hear anything you wanted to share with us. As I say, we're particularly interested in finding out about people at the moment as we've just started this research project. But we're always interested to know about that. And the connections with ICI is certainly something we need to explore. And see if we can track back people who worked at ICI after World War One and see if they worked at HM Factory Gretna. So we would certainly try and find out as much as we can to help you with your inquiry. And it's a very interesting one.
I've sent an email to the info address.
Oh, did you? Oh, great. Lovely. Thank you very much. And thank you for coming along and sharing that with us. That's great. And yeah, thank you. I visited and I'm interested about my grandmother and grandfather. They were both munitions workers and married during World War One, but I don't know if they were at Gretna. He was from Stranraer and she was from Whitley Bay. That's fascinating. Thank you for sharing that Pamela. Again, if you want to email us the details, it's certainly something we can help look into. Even if they weren't at Gretna, we do hold some records relating to other munitions factories.
Thank you.
Hello.
Thank you.
So yeah, we'd be very happy to hear from you if you feel like dropping me an email. Their names.
I do have a copy of their wedding certificates, so that might help.
Yeah, I'm sure that would help. Yeah. And it's not really something I covered in the talk, but a lot of people moved around a great deal during World War One, and they might have worked at numerous munitions factories, or they might have only worked at one for a few months or a year. It wasn't like they were there from the start to the finish, if you see what I'm saying.
I see. Yeah.
So yeah, we'd be really interested to hear about your grandmother and grandfather. So thank you very much for sharing.
Thank you. I'll email in the details.
Yes, please do. That's great. So someone else asked, in the wedding photo, they had impressive bouquets and bridesmaid dresses. This was unusual at the time, or was it not? That's a great question. I think rationing of clothing, as I understand it, wasn't as big an issue in World War One as it was in World War Two. But that's my understanding of it. So one of the photographs we showed was showed the whole family with all the girls dressed and everything. And that was a World War One photograph. But there was also Etty with the chocolate photograph, and she has got a rather beautiful, impressive dress. But I think that was 1945. But then I know rationing went on for a long time afterwards. So, but certainly the lilac dress that was in the lilac dress that was one of my colleagues had, that was her mother's dress, that was sort of a ration dress, so it was trying to be as, you know, as small as possible and use as few pleats as possible, etc., etc. But I know that people pooled their ration coupons to make wedding dresses and things like that, so they saved up and shared them with other people, or they might have reused fabric in the way that that person did with the net curtain. And also, I didn't really discuss it, but we had on display in the exhibition a fake wedding cake from World War II, because most people couldn't afford sugar and marzipan to make the icing. So they just had a very, very small fruit cake, like that sort of size. And then they made a fake cake out of cardboard. And a lot of people use like plaster of Paris to make the icing. And then they put the fake cake on top of the tiny little cake, the real cake, just for the photos and for the look of it. And then when they actually took it off, it was just a plain fruit cake underneath, and very small, so everyone got a crumb. But it made a nice picture. So we had a fake cake in the wedding, in the museum as well for that. So someone else asked, you say you don't have a full list of workers' names, but they will be in the Inland Revenue papers. That's a very good point. Something we've been so thank you, Pat and Paul, who said you could hire fake cakes. Yeah, very good, thank you for that. So something we've been discussing quite a lot recently, as we're trying to get to grips with what we do and don't know about the workers at HM Factory Gretna, is thinking there must be information out there. Where is it? So that's something we've been discussing, whether the Ministry of Defence would have records, where the records might have ended up. They're certainly not in the National Archives, but the Inland Revenue is a possible place to look. We're on to another organisation that's just recently acquired 250,000 records of workers from munitions factory, from munitions factories from World War One onwards. So possibly they might have some information. But yeah, we're always on the lookout for places where we might find things. So ICI is a good way to look. But the Inland Revenue is a good suggestion as well. There must be a list of everyone who worked at HM Factory Gretna in one form or another. You know, there must have been at the time for payroll. There must have been to give the workers the badges. There must have been, but someone may have thrown that information out at some point. It's certainly not anywhere that we've been able to access so far. But you never know what's out there in people's attics or in boxes that people are going to throw out. We get things donated to us. We had something donated last year that someone found in a skip. So there you go. You never know where it might turn up. A priceless book from World War One about chemical processes in HM Factory Gretna that someone found in a skip in Glasgow. So you never know. Keep your eyes open and let us know if you find anything. So were the women in the police at the factory considered a first? That's a good question. I think there had been female police officers before HM Factory Gretna and before World War One, but I believe that they were largely unpaid, like voluntary police officers. So I think this is one of the first large professional police forces. And I think large is really the key thing. I don't think they were the first. I think they were the biggest up to that point, biggest paid professional female police service up to that point. But there had been pioneers in that pre-World War One where they were trying to get women into policing. So thank you very much, everybody, for your questions. Thank you so much for your time and interest. And yes, hopefully you can join us for more of our talks and get involved in our research project. And hopefully someday we can all meet in person and share the wonderful story of the Devil's Porridge Museum in the actual Devil's Porridge Museum that's taken 25 years to build the actual building and get it all together. And hopefully you can come and have a look and have a wonderful day out there sometime soon. Even if you've been before, maybe you'll see it slightly differently after this talk. And we will have a new exhibition on display when we do reopen, looking at Doherty of Pullinger, who was the first female car manufacturer in Scotland. So brilliant story of a Dumfries and Galloway female pioneer. So great, thanks everybody. And yeah, lots of people saying after COVID they'd like to come and see the museum. We'd love to see you there. Okay, thank you very much. Great, I think that's everybody's questions answered. Lovely, thank you very much. This will be on our YouTube and social media, should you wish to relive it. All right, thank you. Goodbye. Nice to see you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.